I need to write a cold, open voiceover that's about 6,500 characters long, focusing on physical description and immediate sensory details of encountering something, without summary or conclusion. The tide had gone out further than any of them expected that morning, and it left the thing sitting in the shallows the way a beached hull sits, heavy, wrong, too large for the water around it. The men on the whaleboat saw it first as a pale band against the grey shingle, a long smear of something that was not ice and was not rock, and for a moment two of them argued quietly about whether it was a stranded fin whale that had died in the night. Then the boat came in closer, and the argument stopped. Whatever it was longer than their two whaleboats laid end to end. And it did not have the shape of anything they had ever hauled up a slipway and cut apart, and between them those men had cut apart a great many things. Stand where they stood. The bay is narrow and steep-sided, a notch in the black volcanic coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, the kind of anchorage a whaling crew ducks into to shelter from a blow and never bothers to name. The water is flat, milky with glacial silt, and the air is dead still in that way the polar air goes still when the wind drops. So still you can hear the meltwater trickling off the ice shelf at the head of the bay, a thin, constant sound like a tap left running in an empty house. And there, grounded in perhaps a metre of water, half in and half out of the shallows, lies the mass, pale, bloated, the colour of a drowned man's hand, that soft, bloodless white that goes faintly green where the light catches it. It is not moving. It has clearly not moved for some time. But nothing about it looks like it belongs to the class of things that die and lie still. The first thing that reaches you is not the sight of it. It is the smell. The men who wrote about it later, and there were not many words, and I will come to why, did not describe it as the smell of a dead whale, and these were men who knew that smell so intimately it lived in their clothes and their hair and the timbers of their ship. A rotting whale is foul in a way that is almost sweet, almost oily, a smell you can name. This was not that. One deckhand, in the single surviving fragment of testimony, called it a smell that got behind the eyes, a chemical sharpness under the rot, like something that had never been meant to touch open air. Two of the crew were sick over the side of the boat before they had even set foot on the shingle. One of them would not go near it again for the rest of the time they lay in that bay. Not once, but they went ashore. Of course they went ashore. You would have gone ashore. And close up, with their boots in the freezing meltwater and the thing rising above them like a grounded barge, the details began to arrive one at a time, each one worse than the last. The body was long and it tapered, not the way a whale tapers to its flukes, but the way a snake tapers, a single continuous serpentine trunk thickening toward the middle and drawing down toward what may have been a tail, though the far end lay submerged and none of them wanted to wade out to find it. Along the flank, running down the length of the pale belly, was the thing that stopped them cold, ribs, or what looked at first like ribs, a row of long curved structures pressing up under the skin, evenly spaced, each one arcing from the spine down toward the underside. And where the skin had gone, because the skin was going, sloughing away in great grey sheets in the meltwater, peeling like wet paper off a wall, those structures were exposed. And they were not ribs. They were too long, too fine, too many. They splayed. They branched at their ends. They looked, one man said, and it is the detail that has kept me up more nights than I care to admit. They looked like fingers. Rows of long, jointed fingers folded flat against the body, dozens of them, laid down the creature's side the way you might fold your own hand flat against your leg. The skin itself came away in the cold water in slow, curling ribbons, and beneath it the flesh was not the deep red-black muscle of a whale, but something paler and more fibrous, marbled, threaded through with those long finger things. Where the meltwater ran over the exposed tissue, it clouded instantly, turning the clear glacial runoff a milky, oily grey, so that the shallows around the Carcass had their own dead colour, a slick that spread out across the bay and did not disperse. The men noticed that. They noticed the water around it had gone wrong. And they noticed, standing there in the wind that had begun to pick up again off the ice, that not a single bird had come. in a bay with a carcass this size, in a place where the skuas and the petrels descend on a dead seal within the hour and strip it to bone in a day, there was nothing in the air, nothing on the water. The scavengers of the most scavenged coast on earth had looked at this thing, and they had stayed away. The oldest man aboard, a gunner who had worked the Southern Ocean for the better part of 20 years, who had seen sperm whales and blue whales and the strange half-rotted lumps that wash up on every whaling ground, and that sailors have always called sea serpents until you get close and see the whale in them, walked the whole length of it once, slowly, from the head that lay half buried in the shingle to the point where the trunk vanished under the milky water. He walked it once, and then he stood at the head end for a long time and said nothing. And when the mate finally asked him the only question that mattered, "What is it? What do we log it as?" the old gunner did not say a whale. He did not say a shark or a squid or any of the honest ordinary names that a career at sea gives a man to put over his fear. He said he did not know. He said he had never seen it before, and he had never heard of it, and he did not want to be the one to write the name down. So look at it the way they looked at it, before anyone reached for a camera or a knife, before the sample jars and the saws and the order that came down the following week to strike this water from the charts and never speak of it. Look at the pale bulk of it grounded in the meltwater, the sheets of skin unwinding into the shallows, the long folded fingers rising along its side as the flesh gave way. And hold in your mind the single fact the whole rest of this story hangs from. These were not tourists. These were not frightened villagers with a legend. These were professional butchers of the largest animals that have ever lived, standing in front of a body the length of 2 of their own boats, and not one of them could tell you what animal it had been. They came at it slowly, the way men approach a fire that has already burned someone. The mate went first, because it was his job to go first, and behind him came 4 of the crew with the tools a whaling deck makes available: flensing knives long as a man's arm, a boat hook, a coil of line, and the ship's plate camera in its scuffed wooden box, carried by the young Swede who kept the photographic record because he had steadier hands than anyone else and did not drink at sea. They logged the bay before they touched the thing. That detail matters, and I want you to hold on to it, because it is the first act of a crew that already understood, without saying so, that they might one day need to prove where they had been. The mate took a bearing off the 2 headlands and the glacier tongue at the back of the bay, wrote the coordinates into the working chart in pencil, and drew a small, careful cross in the shallows where the body lay. He gave the bay no name. There was a blank space beside the cross where a name should go, and he left it blank, and that blank space is the last honest thing anyone in this story was allowed to keep. Then they got close, and close changed everything. From the deck, it had been a pale mass, a whale-shaped wrongness, the kind of thing the eye tries to force into a familiar outline. From 10 feet away, the outline broke apart into details that no whale carries. The trunk of it was long, and it did not taper the way a whale tapers, blunt at the head and thinning to a fluke. It kept its thickness far down its length, and then it curved, a slow, serpentine curve into the water, the body of something built to move by bending side to side, not by driving a horizontal tail up and down the way every great sea mammal on this earth moves. A whale is a barrel with a tail. This was a rope with a girth. And along its flank, where the sloughing skin had peeled back and lifted away in the meltwater like wet paper off a wall, they saw the limbs, paired limbs, folded. 2 of them held tight against the body high on the trunk, and the shape of them under the ruined skin was the shape that stops a man's breath, because the men who saw it kept reaching, in their broken accounts, for the same impossible word. Hands, not flippers, not the flat paddle of a seal or the long wing bone of a whale's fin. The limbs folded against that serpentine trunk ended in a splay of long jointed elements, 4 or 5 of them fanned out and curled slightly inward, ribbed and tapering, and when the flesh had rotted back off them, what stood exposed along the animal's side looked for all the world like fingers. Fingers the length of a boat hook. The young Swede would say, years later, to the one man he ever told, that it was the fingers that made him set the camera down and step back before he could bring himself to pick it up again. and the mouth. The head lay half in the shingle, turned slightly so that the near side of the jaw was clear of the ground, and the jaw had fallen open in death the way jaws do. But what was set into it did not fall into any pattern a butcher knows. A sperm whale carries its teeth in a single row along the lower jaw, 40-some pegs meant for gripping squid. A killer whale carries interlocking cones. This mouth carried teeth set in rings. Circles of them, concentric, ring inside ring receding back into the dark of the throat, each ring smaller than the last, each tooth curved and backward hooked so that anything the ring closed on could only go one way, inward. It was not a mouth for biting. It was a mouth for swallowing, a mouth built like a funnel of hooks, and there is no animal in the whole catalogue of the Southern Ocean, no animal in the whole honest catalogue of the sea, that a whaler of 20 years could match it to. The gunner had been right to keep his silence. There was nothing to write down. They set the man beside it for scale. This was not showmanship. It was procedure. The same procedure they used for a record-length blue whale. A man stood against the carcass so the photograph could carry a measurement home. One of the deckhands, told to stand at the midpoint of the trunk, walked out along the shingle and turned to face the camera, and in the frame that the young Swede exposed on a single glass plate, the man comes up to somewhere near the folded limbs, his cap level with the lowest of the exposed fingers, and the body runs off past him in both directions, past the head buried in the shingle on one side, and past the point where the trunk slid under the milk-coloured water on the other. 2 whaleboats, end to end, and the man a small, dark, upright thing against it. That plate existed. Men held it. It went into the company's hands the following week, and it has never, in 100 years, come out again. But in this part of the story, it still exists. It is still in the wooden box, and it is the only reason we can speak of any of this at all. And then there was the smell. Every man who has ever worked a whaling ground knows the smell of a rotting whale. It is one of the foundational horrors of the trade, a stench so total that men learn to eat and sleep and work inside it. These men knew that smell. This was not that smell. 2 of the crew, hardened to the reek of flensed blubber and days-old carcass, got within a few feet of the opened flank and were sick where they stood, on their knees in the shingle, and could not stop. It was not the sweetness of ordinary rot. Those who tried to describe it never agreed on what it was. One reached for the reek of a struck match, another for something chemical and cold at the back of the throat, a burning that had no heat in it, but they agreed it was wrong, that it did not belong to death as they knew death, and that it seemed to come up stronger from the peeled-back places where the fingers showed. One man, and this is the detail I keep returning to, because a frightened man's body knows things before his mind will admit them, one man simply turned and walked back toward the boat and would not go near it again. Not that day, not the next. He gave no reason a reasonable man would give. He said only that he did not want it on him. He did not yet know how right he was. None of them knew, standing there in the meltwater with the camera and the knives, that the thing had already begun to reach back for them, and that the changes it would work on the men who touched it would come faster and stranger than the changes the cold and the sea had worked on it. I'm moving into the 3rd section now, about 6,500 characters, continuing the narrative with specific details, a deckhand marked by weeping sores, sample jars that cloud and burst, the bay struck from navigation charts, a plate surrendered, crew members reassigned, all delivered in that calm, grave documentary tone. It began with the deckhand who had done the cutting. His name appears in the fragmentary crew list that survives only as a first initial and a surname, and I will not pretend to more certainty than that, but the account is consistent across the 2 second-hand tellings that reached print decades later. He was the one who had opened the flank, who had worked the long knife down through the sloughing skin to reach whatever lay beneath, and he had done it with bare forearms because a whaler works wet, and a man does not stop to think about what he is elbow deep in. Within 2 days, the skin of those forearms began to weep. Not a rash as a doctor would name it, Not the ordinary chaff and salt sore that every hand aboard carried as a matter of course, but small open places that would not close, that ran clear fluid and then something less clear, and that spread outward from where the carcass had touched him in a pattern the other men could see and did not like to look at. He kept it wrapped. He was ashamed of it, the way men of that generation were ashamed of anything the body did without permission, and he worked on with it wrapped until the wrapping would not stay dry. I have gone looking, honestly, for a sober medical name for this. There are real ones. There is a bacterium that lives in cold marine waters and enters through the smallest cut, and does exactly this, eats slowly outward through the skin of fishermen and seal hunters, and it is well documented, and it is terrible enough on its own. I want to put it here plainly, because it may be the whole of it. But the men on that deck did not reach for a bacterium. They reached for the thing in the shingle. They had watched him cut it, and they had watched what came off his arms, and in the closed logic of a small crew in a large emptiness, the two facts fused into one and could not be pulled apart again. He was the man who had gone into it. Now something was coming out of him. That was the shape the story took, and once a story takes that shape aboard a ship, no amount of reasoning dislodges it. And then there were the jars. This is the part I find hardest to set aside, because it is the part that should have been the proof, the thing done right, the thing done by the book. Someone aboard, and it was likely the mate or whoever among them carried a scrap of scientific ambition, had the presence of mind to take samples. Tissue, fluid, a section of the ringed jaw, if the accounts are to be believed, sealed into glass jars of the kind every whaling ship carried for exactly this purpose, packed for the long voyage back to a port where someone in a collar and a laboratory would want to see them. This is how a monster becomes a specimen. This is the single act that turns a sailor's yarn into a line in a museum catalogue. If those jars had come home, we would not be guessing. We would have a name, or we would at least have an argument conducted in daylight by people with microscopes. The jars did not come home. Within days of being sealed, the glass began to cloud. The contents, whatever they were, went first opaque and then wrong, and the accounts speak of the fluid darkening and the pressure building until the seals failed, until the jars, one after another, clouded and swelled and burst. Now, I can construct the sober explanation for you, and I will, because you deserve it. Decomposing tissue produces gas, gas builds pressure, an improperly vented seal fails, and the clouding is nothing more than bacterial bloom in a warm hold. That is entirely possible. That is, in fact, probably what a chemist would tell you happened, and I cannot refute it. But consider what it meant aboard that ship. The one attempt to preserve the thing, to bring a piece of it into the world of evidence and daylight, had destroyed itself in the dark of the hold, had spoiled and ruptured, and left nothing behind but stained glass, and a smell in a sealed compartment that the men now had a name for. Every effort to hold on to it failed. The photograph would survive. Nothing else would. It was as though the thing consented to be seen once, at a distance, beside a standing man, and refused every closer form of keeping. By the following week, the decisions were no longer being made on the deck. They were being made by the company. I want to be careful here, because this is where a story like this one wants to become a conspiracy, and I do not think it was a conspiracy, and I think the truth is quieter and, in its way, more disturbing. What happened is what large, careful organizations do when something appears on their books that they cannot categorize and do not want to be responsible for. The bay was struck from the working charts, not renamed, not flagged, not annotated with a warning, struck, removed from the sheets the fleet actually used, so that the water the thing had touched simply ceased to have a name a captain could steer toward. It was posted off-limits, and the men understood off-limits the way men in a company town understand it, as a thing you do not test if you want to keep sailing. The photographic plate, the one piece of hard evidence, the shape beside the man, was surrendered to the company, handed up. It went into an office, and it did not come out, and I will come in the last part of this to where it may have gone, because that thread runs further than you would expect. And the crew were reassigned. This is the detail that tells me the company was frightened. whatever it was frightened of, not of a monster, perhaps, but of liability, of scandal, of a sick man and a lost season and questions from a port authority. They did not keep the crew together. They broke them up, distributed them across separate vessels for the voyages that followed, so that the 8 or 10 men who had stood in that shingle and smelled that smell and watched those arms weep were never again in one room at one time. A story dies when the people who carry it can no longer stand together and say, "You were there, you saw it too." Scatter the witnesses, and you do not have to burn a single document. The account simply thins into a thing each man half remembers and cannot corroborate, and mistrusts in himself, and finally stops telling. The deckhand carried his arms and his silence off to another ship. The man who would not touch it carried whatever he had refused to touch. And the bay, unnamed now on the sheets they steered by, closed behind them as if it had never held anything at all. I said the plate went into an office and did not come out, and that the thread runs further than you would expect. Here is where it runs. There is a line in the company's transferred records, held now in a regional maritime archive in Vestfold, in a bundle of whaling correspondence that was never catalogued with any care because no one thought it mattered. An inventory of photographic materials logged as received from the field for the 1924 season, and against one entry, a single plate, there is a notation in a clerk's hand: not received. Received on the manifest that left the ship. Not received at the office that was meant to hold it. Somewhere between the deck and the desk, the one image of the thing beside the standing man became a plate that 2 separate ledgers describe in 2 irreconcilable ways, and that contradiction is the last physical trace of it that I have been able to touch. I spent a long time with that single line. I wanted it to be a filing error. It reads like a filing error. But a filing error is also exactly what a vanishing looks like when no one wants to be seen doing the vanishing. You will ask, as I asked, why not simply go and look? The coordinates are logged. The bay was charted before it was struck. The whalers who found it wrote its position down in the working book before anyone told them to forget it, and those figures survive in a fair copy that escaped the culling of the sheets. And so I traced them. I put the 1924 coordinates against the modern surveys of that stretch of the peninsula, the ones flown and sounded and satellite fixed to a precision those whalers could not have dreamed of. And the bay is not there, not sealed, not renamed, not hidden behind a permit, not there. The coastline at that latitude gives a headland and open water and a glacier tongue that has advanced and retreated within the margin of a century, and no inlet answers to the shape the Norwegians drew. Ice moves. Coastlines in that country are not the fixed things we imagine coastlines to be. A bay that held a Carcass in 1924 could be under 100 meters of glacier now, or scoured open into a bight that no longer closes, and this is the honest and unsatisfying truth of it. The water the thing touched may simply have been swallowed by the continent that is always swallowing things there. Or the figures were wrong or altered, or the fair copy I trust was already a copy of a lie. I cannot tell you which. I can only tell you that the one place on Earth where the question could be settled is a place I cannot point you to on any chart that exists. So let me give the sober reading its full weight, because it deserves it, and because I have lived with it long enough to feel its pull. A basking shark, decomposing, loses its gills and its lower jaw first, and what remains is a long, pale pseudo-body with a slender false neck and a tangle of exposed fin supports that a frightened man in bad light will read as limbs, as fingers, as arms folded against a trunk. This is not speculation. It is the documented career of a dozen so-called sea monsters that turned out to be rotting sharks, and it explains the ribbing, the serpentine line, the paired structures folded against the body. The stench is the ordinary, staggering stench of advanced marine decay, ammoniac and sulphurous and strong enough to empty a stomach at 10 paces. The teeth in rings, the detail I keep returning to, could be the cartilaginous rings of a throat laid bare, mistaken for jaws, mistaken for something with a mouth built to close on a man. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it persuasive, that a whale carcass warped by cold and depth and time into a monstrous silhouette is not a supernatural thing but a very natural one, and that men who had butchered 1,000 whales could still be undone by the one that came apart into a shape they had no name for. And then I set that reading down beside the saws, because rot does not do that. Decomposition is foul, and it is dangerous, and it will sicken a man who works in it unprotected, but it does not raise weeping wounds on the arm of the one man who cut deep and cloud-sealed glass and burst the jars. The sober explanation accounts for the shape and the smell and every visible thing, and it does not account for what the thing did after they touched it. It does not account for a company that saw a rotting shark on a beach and responded by breaking up a crew and striking a bay from the charts and losing a photographic plate between two ledgers. You do not scatter 10 men across 10 ships because they found a dead fish. You do not unname water because a whale came apart in it. The sober reading explains the carcass and leaves the fear entirely unexplained, and it is the fear, in the end, that was documented. The saws, the reassignments, the struck coordinates, the plate that arrived and did not arrive. Whatever it was, it frightened the people who dealt in death for a living, and they answered that fear with the one tool a company always has, which is silence. I keep going back to the beach, to the moment before any of it, before the jars and the saws and the clerk's careful, ruinous notation. A pale mass the length of 2 whaleboats, grounded in the shallows of a bay that no longer has a name, its skin sloughing away in the meltwater to show the ribbing underneath that looked to the men standing over it like fingers. One of them stepped in close so the others could measure the thing against him, and someone made the single image that would later arrive and not arrive, and for a moment there was a human being, and whatever this was, together, in the frame, in the cold, with the smell already rising off it. They photographed it. They measured it. They wrote down where they were. They did everything a careful man does when he wants the record to survive him, and within a week the record was gone, the water was gone from the charts, and the men were gone from each other. If it was only rot, only a shark, only the ordinary undoing of something that had once been alive, then it cost nothing to say so, and everything they did next was madness. And if it was not, if there was a reason to close the water it had touched, then that reason is still out there, under the ice or under the ledger, at coordinates that answer to nothing. They took the answer to their graves. So I will leave you where they were left, on a shingle at the edge of a bay that the maps no longer admit exists, standing over a thing that matched no animal they had ever cut, asking the only question that ever mattered and the only one no one would answer. If it was only rot, why seal the water it touched?